He was paying rent but still got kicked out of his own room, so he did something nobody expected. Imagine paying rent every single month, holding up your end of a real financial agreement, and still getting told to pack up your stuff and sleep on the couch so someone else can have your room. Not a hotel room. Not a spare space. Your room. The one you are literally paying for. And the worst part is this was not even the first time it had happened. So our guy is 18 years old, newly working full-time, and contributing financially to the household in a real and meaningful way. He is not a kid bumming off his parents anymore. He is a tenant. And his parents made a specific promise to him that since he was now paying rent, the days of being bumped out of his room for visiting family were officially over. That promise lasted right up until the moment it became inconvenient for them to keep it. Let us go back and understand exactly what kind of pattern had been building here for years before any of this came to a head. Growing up, every time family came to visit from his dad's side, there was one person in that household who got displaced. Not the 12-year-old. Not the 13-year-old. Not the 16-year-old. Just him. Always him. And it was not just the occasional visit, it was a lot of visits. Picture it happening again and again across the years, a rotating cast of aunts and uncles and cousins showing up and the house quietly rearranging itself to accommodate them, and the rearrangement always, every single time, centered on him. His brothers never had to move out of their spaces. Their rooms stayed theirs no matter how many people showed up. But our guy would get shuffled off to the couch, sometimes with very little warning, while blow-up mattresses got added to his room for the guests. There was no negotiation. There was no rotating schedule where maybe this time one of the other brothers took a turn. It was just assumed that he would be the one to give way, and that assumption was never questioned out loud by anyone except him. That is not a small thing. Being consistently singled out like that sends a message whether your parents intend it or not. It says your comfort matters less. It says your space is the flexible one. It says you are the one who can be inconvenienced because you will handle it. And when you are a kid, you absorb that. You do not just feel it once and shake it off. It settles into you slowly, visit by visit, year by year, until it becomes part of how you understand your place in that family. You start to wonder what it means that it is always you and never them. You replay the moments looking for some logic that makes it fair, some explanation that makes it make sense, and when you cannot find one you are left sitting with something uncomfortable and unnamed. He talked to his parents about it multiple times and it sounds like those conversations mostly went nowhere, the kind of conversations where you walk away feeling like you said the words but somehow nothing landed, until finally last year he felt like they had actually heard him. They told him they had not wanted him to feel that way and that they would do better. And for a moment maybe he thought things had actually changed. Maybe he let himself feel a small, cautious sense of relief. Maybe he told himself that it had taken a while but they had finally gotten it. Then he turned 18, got a full-time job, and started paying rent. This is where the dynamic should have fundamentally shifted in a concrete and undeniable way. He was not just a kid with feelings anymore. He was a paying contributor to that household, someone who was showing up every single month with money in hand and holding up his end of a real grown adult arrangement. There is something significant about that transition, not just financially but emotionally. It is a young person saying, I am ready to operate in the world as an adult, and I expect to be treated accordingly. And to his credit he used that moment to formalize something that should have been common courtesy all along. He told them plainly that since he was now paying for his room, the least they could do was respect that it was his. They agreed. That was the deal on the table and everyone shook hands on it, so to speak. No lawyers, no documents, just a spoken promise between a son and his parents that carried the full weight of every previous conversation they had ever had about this exact issue. 1 month ago that deal got thrown in the trash. Family came to visit, his parents told him to give up his room again, and when he tried to stand his ground and point out that they had made an agreement, they pulled out the oldest card in the parental playbook. It is our house, it is our decision, end of conversation. Just like that, years of conversations and one very specific promise evaporated the second they became an obstacle to what his parents wanted to do. And look, technically they are not wrong that it is their house. Nobody is disputing the deed. But when you have entered into a financial arrangement with someone, even informally, even without paperwork, you cannot just unilaterally decide the terms no longer apply because guests are coming and it would be easier if everyone just went along with the plan. That is not how agreements work. That is not even how basic respect works. What they were really saying in that moment, whether they understood it or not, was that his money was welcome but his standing as someone whose agreements mattered was not. Here is what gets me every single time I hear a story like this. They really thought he was going to just take it again. Think about what that assumption requires. It requires them to have looked at this young man, this person who had come to them multiple times over the years with real pain about this exact issue, who had negotiated a specific and meaningful agreement tied to actual money, and to have concluded that he would once again quietly pick up his pillow, trudge out to the living room, and let it go. That assumption did not come from nowhere. It came from years of him doing exactly that, years of him absorbing the displacement and not making it into something bigger because he was a kid and what else were his options. But he was not a kid anymore and they had apparently not updated their picture of him. After years of being the one who always gave up his space. After the conversations. After the promise. After the rent payments. They genuinely expected him to shrug and head to the couch like nothing had changed. And that assumption tells you everything about how they had been viewing him this entire time. Not as someone whose needs and agreements mattered, but as the one kid who would always bend. So instead of bending, he called his grandparents on his mom's side and asked if he could move in. They said yes immediately. Not hesitantly, not with conditions, not after a long pause to think it over. Immediately. And then they drove over and helped him pack. I want you to picture that scene for a moment because I think it matters. His grandparents, people who did not have to do anything here, who could have told him to work it out with his parents, instead got in the car and showed up. They walked into that house and helped their grandson load his belongings because they understood something his parents had failed to understand, which is that when someone finally decides enough is enough, you do not talk them out of it, you show up for them. His parents watched this unfold and apparently thought it was some kind of dramatic gesture, like a teenager storming off and coming back an hour later with all the feelings processed and nowhere else to actually go. They did not realize he was serious until they actually saw his belongings going out the door and into the car, until the reality of it became physical and undeniable right there in front of them. And then the response they had was something else entirely. They told him he could not just leave. They told him that since he was paying rent he owed them proper notice. Let that sit for a second. Let it really settle. The same parents who had just looked him in the face and told him the agreement he had paid into did not matter were now invoking that very agreement to demand he follow proper tenant procedures before leaving. Which is a fascinating position to take after you just violated the very agreement that rent was supposed to protect. You cannot invoke his status as a tenant to demand he follow proper notice procedures while simultaneously ignoring the tenant protections you promised him. You do not get to use the rules only when they benefit you. You do not get to hand someone a set of responsibilities while quietly pocketing the rights. Since then they have been calling what he did childish and overdramatic. They told him the visiting family members felt awkward and like they were intruding. And I want to sit with that for a second because that is genuinely a remarkable thing to say to your son. Think about everything that had happened. Think about the years of displacement and the conversations that went in circles and the promise that got made and then discarded and the rent money that kept coming every month regardless. After all of that, the thing his parents chose to lead with was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement that they had broken their word. It was that the guests felt a little uncomfortable. The guests. Not the kid who has been displaced repeatedly over years. Not the 18-year-old who trusted them enough to make a financial agreement and got burned the very first time that agreement was tested. The guests felt awkward. That is where their concern landed. That is what they decided was worth saying out loud. Let me be very clear about where I stand on this, and I am not going to soften it. He is not the asshole here. Not even slightly. What he did was the only logical response available to someone who had exhausted every other option. He had the conversation. He had it multiple times over years. He reached a specific agreement tied to a real financial arrangement. And the moment that agreement was violated, he responded by removing himself from a situation where his agreements clearly did not mean anything. That is not childish. That is self-respect. The real story here is not a kid throwing a tantrum. It is a young man who finally stopped hoping his family would treat him fairly and started making decisions that reflected his actual worth. Moving out without fanfare, without a dramatic fight, without begging or pleading, without a screaming match in the hallway or a long tearful speech about everything he had been carrying, just quietly calling his grandparents and getting out of a house where he was paying to be treated as less important than everyone else. That takes clarity. That takes calm. That is not the move of someone who is being dramatic. His parents want him to move back in, and I understand that. Family dynamics are complicated, and there is clearly love somewhere underneath all of this, buried under the defensiveness and the pride and the years of a pattern nobody wanted to examine too closely. But if he moves back in without anything fundamentally changing, without a real and honest conversation about what happened and why and what needs to be different, he is just signing up for the same cycle again. The only thing that has shifted so far is that his parents are embarrassed and maybe a little shocked that he actually had somewhere else to go, that he had people in his corner willing to show up for him when it counted. That is not the same as understanding what they did wrong. And until they actually grapple with the pattern of behavior that led to this moment, moving back changes nothing. The verdict here is simple. He was singled out for years, promised things would change, entered into a financial agreement based on that promise, and then got told the agreement did not matter when it became inconvenient. He left. Good. He should have left the first time they broke the promise. The guests being uncomfortable is not his problem. It was never his problem. And anyone telling him he was overdramatic needs to ask themselves what the appropriate response is when someone takes your money and then kicks you out of the room they are charging you for. She stole the wrong pumpkin pie and her roommate finally lost it in the most satisfying way. She bought a personal pumpkin pie, wrote her name on the box, put it in the refrigerator, and came back to find her roommate standing there eating the whole thing. Not a slice. Not a little taste. The whole thing. Right in front of her. And honestly, the audacity of that moment is something I need everyone to fully picture before we go any further. So here is the situation. Our narrator is 27 and she had a roommate arrangement that was working fine, or at least fine enough, until the roommate got pregnant and the boyfriend moved in. Before that, the apartment had a rhythm to it. Two people sharing a space, keeping mostly to themselves, staying out of each other's way in the way that good roommates do. Nobody was best friends, but nobody was causing problems either. And at first, even after the boyfriend arrived and the pregnancy was announced, things were manageable. The boyfriend was not loud, not intrusive, not the kind of person who takes up more space than he needs to. The roommate was still the same person she had always been, more or less. But as the weeks turned into months and the pregnancy progressed, something in the dynamic shifted. It was gradual at first, the way these things always are. A little more comfortable. A little more entitled. A little more bold about helping herself to things that sat on the shared shelves and in the shared refrigerator that did not actually belong to her. The main issue that kept coming up over and over again was food. Her food kept disappearing. Not crumbs. Not the last little bit of something that someone might accidentally finish without thinking. Full portions. Specific items she had bought for herself, planned meals, things she was looking forward to eating after a long day. And every time she tried to address it, every time she opened her mouth to say something about it, the pregnancy cravings card got played like a get-out-of-jail-free card with infinite uses. Now here's what I want to say about that because I think it matters. Pregnancy cravings are real. Nobody is arguing that. Growing a human being does things to your body and your hunger and your relationship with food that are genuinely hard to control sometimes. The pull towards certain flavors or textures can feel urgent and overwhelming in a way that is not entirely rational and not entirely within your control. But the existence of a craving does not give you permission to eat someone else's food without asking. Those are two completely separate things. You can have an intense craving for something and still walk over to your roommate and say, "Hey, I am really desperate for some of this. Can I have a bit or can we get more for me?" One option respects the other person. The other option just helps yourself and invokes the pregnancy as a retroactive justification. And the difference between those two options is not a pregnancy symptom. It is a character choice. The pumpkin pie situation is where everything reached its tipping point, and I have to say the detail of writing her name on the box is doing a lot of work in this story. She did not just buy something and put it in the fridge with the hope that her roommate would leave it alone. She physically labeled it. She took the time to write her name on the box in clear, deliberate letters because she already knew, after months of having her food disappear, that passive hope was not going to be enough. That label was not passive. It was a statement. It was her saying out loud, without words, "This belongs to me and I want you to see that before you reach for it." And she still came home to find the roommate standing there at the open refrigerator, not sneaking, not apologetic, not even slightly furtive, eating the entire thing as if the name on the box was a suggestion and not a boundary. Not a slice taken in a moment of weakness. The whole thing. The entire personal pie eaten while she was gone, and the roommate did not even have the grace to finish before she got back. Yeah, I would have lost it too. Because that moment is not just about a pie. That moment is the physical proof that nothing she did was ever going to be enough. She labeled it and it still got eaten. She said something and it still kept happening. At a certain point, that is not a craving problem. That is a respect problem. When she snapped and yelled, she said she did not give one single thing about her roommate's baby. And I want to be honest about what that sentence is and what it is not. In that moment, she was not making a philosophical statement about the well-being of an unborn child. She was not expressing a wish for anything bad to happen to anyone. She was not a villain revealing her true feelings about pregnancy or babies or families. She was a person who had been grinding through months of having her concerns dismissed and her food taken and her frustration absorbed and deflected, and she finally reached the point where all of that came out at once, raw and unfiltered and loud. The baby had been used as a shield every single time this came up. Every conversation about missing food ended with the pregnancy invoked like a trump card that made further discussion impossible. And after months of that pattern, after being talked over and dismissed and made to feel like she was the unreasonable one for simply wanting her groceries to still be there when she got home, she finally said out loud what she had probably been thinking quietly for a very long time. That the pregnancy did not make any of this okay. That she was exhausted by it being used as an excuse for behavior that would be completely unacceptable under any other circumstances. The roommate's reaction was to gasp and run off to tell her boyfriend, who then came at our narrator calling her a name for yelling at a pregnant woman who cannot control her cravings. And this is where the whole thing tips from being about pumpkin pie into being about something much bigger. Because the boyfriend swooping in with anger and accusations rather than any acknowledgement that his girlfriend had spent months repeatedly taking food that did not belong to her is its own kind of problem. There was no conversation that started with, "Hey, I know she has been eating your food without asking and that is not okay. Let us figure out a better solution together." There was no moment of accountability, no recognition that the person standing there being called names had actually been the wronged party in this situation from the very beginning. It jumped straight from being caught eating someone else's labeled personal pie to calling that person a bad word for finally reacting. The person who took the food became the victim. And the person who had her food taken, her concerns dismissed, and her patience exhausted over the course of months became the one who owed an apology. The entitlement here is layered and I genuinely cannot overstate that. Let me walk through what our narrator actually had to deal with. She had food taken repeatedly over the course of months, not once or twice but in a sustained pattern that wore her down slowly and made the simple act of grocery shopping feel pointless. She tried to address it and got shut down with the pregnancy justification every single time, never getting a real conversation, never getting an apology, never getting any actual resolution, just the same wall going up the moment she tried to speak. She specifically bought a small personal item just for herself, something she had been looking forward to, put her name on the box in plain writing so there could be no confusion or misreading of the situation, and still had it eaten entirely. And when she finally reacted with genuine anger after all of that, she became the villain of the story. That is the conclusion the boyfriend and the roommate arrived at together. That is the version of events they decided to defend. And it is completely backwards. Here is my take and I am not going to dance around it. She is not the asshole. What she said was blunt and it was raw, and she said it in a moment of genuine frustration after a pattern of behavior that had been grinding her down for a long time. It was not a calm or measured response. It was a real human reaction to being pushed past a breaking point by someone who kept using the same excuse to justify taking what was not hers. And the fact that it came out sharp does not make her wrong. It makes her human. The actual problem here is that the roommate never took accountability. Not once in this whole story does she say, "You know what, I have been eating your food and that is not fair and I am sorry." Instead, every confrontation ends with her invoking the pregnancy and the conversation closing before anything is resolved. That is not a pregnancy symptom. That is a choice. And that distinction matters more than anything else in this entire situation. And the boyfriend backing that pattern up by calling our narrator names for finally snapping is not protecting his pregnant girlfriend, it is just reinforcing behavior that was already out of control. If anything needs to happen at this point, it is a serious conversation about boundaries in that apartment, ideally with something written down. Who is responsible for what food? What the rules are about shared and personal items. What happens when those rules are broken? Because pregnancy or no pregnancy, living with other people requires a baseline of respect for their space and their belongings. And what happened in that apartment over the past several months was not that. It was one person repeatedly taking from another person and weaponizing a personal circumstance to avoid any real consequence. The pumpkin pie was just the moment it finally came to a head. The closing line here is this: you do not get to steal someone's food for months, eat their entire labeled pie right in front of them, and then act horrified when they finally say something loud enough that you actually hear it. She said what she said. It was not pretty. But she earned the right to say it. Alright, drop a comment down below telling me which story hit you harder, because I genuinely cannot decide. If you enjoyed this one, a like and a subscribe would mean a lot.